My name is Harvey Ellison. I'm 76 years old, and for the last 6 years, I've lived in a house that isn't mine, under a roof that shelters me, but never truly accepts me. They say growing old is like returning to childhood, but that's a lie told by people who've never sat alone in a basement with their dignity leaking out, drop by drop, like water from a rusted pipe. I used to have a life, a wife, a home. I used to have respect. Now I have a mattress on a concrete floor, a metal chair, and a narrow window near the ceiling that lets in a sliver of light, just enough to remind me of everything I lost. I was a staff sergeant in Vietnam, 2 tours, came back with shrapnel in my left shoulder and a scar across my rib cage that still burns when it rains. But I also came back with pride, a sense of honor. I worked 35 years at the Postal Service after that, not missing a single day except when my wife, Ellen, gave birth to our son Daniel. She was the kind of woman who kept the world together, quietly, with hands always busy and eyes always watching. Ellen died of breast cancer 6 years ago. That's when the foundation of my life cracked so loud. I'm still hearing the echo. Daniel, Danny back then, was her heart. I think that's why I never really connected with him the way she did. He was soft where I was hard, questioning where I followed orders. When he turned 18 and said he wouldn't enlist, I didn't speak to him for 3 months. I thought he was weak. I told him as much. What I didn't tell him was that I envied his freedom to choose. Still, Ellen made us talk again, made me go to his college graduation, made me try. And I did try. But some wounds don't close just because you want them to. Some start bleeding the moment you take your eyes off them. After Ellen passed, Daniel offered to take me in. I was fragile then. I'd just had a mild stroke, and the doctor said I shouldn't be living alone. I remember how he framed it. "It'll be good for you, Dad. You won't have to worry about anything. We'll take care of you." At the time, it sounded like mercy. Now I understand it was logistics. I was a package with no address of my own, easier to manage in the basement than in a care facility. His wife Sharon never said much about the arrangement, but her silences said plenty. The way she set the table for 3 and never invited me up. The way she knocked once, softly, before opening the door to bring leftovers like she was feeding a stray cat. The basement became my world. At first, I told myself it was temporary. I'd recover, get stronger, maybe even drive again. I still had my pension, my Social Security, and a little savings. I thought I'd be able to rent a small place someday. But months turned into years, and strength turned into stiffness. My right leg, still affected by the stroke, started giving out more often. The walks to the upstairs bathroom became events I planned with the same care I used to plan combat missions. I started using a plastic urinal to avoid the stairs at night. Dignity, I discovered, doesn't vanish in a dramatic whoosh. It evaporates, bit by bit, one compromise at a time. Daniel works in tech support. From home, mostly. I can hear him through the ceiling during the day, his voice changing tones depending on who he's talking to. Friendly for clients, clipped and annoyed for Sharon. They argue often, mostly about money. She wants to open her own salon, and he wants to invest in crypto. I don't pretend to understand any of it. I only know that when they come down to see me, it's rarely to ask how I'm doing. More often, it's to remind me that the water bill went up or that the refrigerator isn't a charity. They feed me on their schedule. Lunch, if I'm lucky, arrives around 2. Dinner after 7. Some days I get both. Some days I don't. I don't complain. I learned early that complaints are invitations for contempt. I keep quiet. I read old newspapers. I do crossword puzzles until the clues start repeating themselves. I watch the basement window and measure the hours by the position of the sunbeam across the floor. I keep my military medals in a shoebox under the bed. Sometimes late at night, I take them out one by one and hold them in my hands. Bronze Star, Purple Heart. They feel heavier now than they used to. Maybe because they mean less. Maybe because they're the last pieces of a man who used to matter. Once, Daniel came downstairs and caught me with the medals. He laughed. "Why do you keep those? You're not going to war again, Dad." I didn't answer. I didn't tell him that I wasn't holding on to the medals. I was holding on to the memory of being someone. He used to call me sir when he was little. Ellen taught him that. "Show your father respect," she'd say. And he would snap a little salute with his chubby fingers, grinning. I can't remember the last time he looked me in the eyes, let alone said my name without some edge of irritation. Sometimes I wonder if I deserve it, if I was too cold, too rigid, too much of a soldier, and not enough of a father. Regret is a quiet companion. It doesn't yell. It whispers while you lie awake. About 6 months ago, I began to notice things missing. First, my checkbook. Then my bank statements. I asked Daniel, and he said, "Don't worry about it. I'm managing everything now." It sounded almost reasonable, but there was a tone in his voice that made my skin crawl, like he was speaking to a pet or a toddler. A few weeks later, he told me he'd changed the mailing address for my accounts to make things easier. That was when I started hiding cash. I'd squirrel away a 5 here, a 10 there, just in case. But just in case is a fantasy when your body doesn't obey you. I fell in the shower once, crawled to the door, lay there until Sharon came down hours later and screamed when she saw the blood. They bought me a shower chair after that, not out of concern, but because they didn't want to deal with the mess again. I heard her say it when she thought I was asleep. If he falls again, he might die. And then what? We get blamed? Daniel didn't answer. I suppose he was thinking the same thing I was, that dying would be easier than surviving like this. I'm not dramatic by nature. I've always believed in taking what life gives you and making do. But lately, I've started to wonder if I've outlived my usefulness, if I'm just a breathing relic taking up space. Daniel's tone when he speaks to me has changed. There's no warmth, no affection, only obligation, or worse, resentment. I can feel it in the way he throws the food tray down or sighs when I ask for help reaching something. The other day, I asked for a second blanket because the basement gets cold at night. He rolled his eyes and said, "You're lucky you have heat at all. Some people are on the street." He's not wrong, but that doesn't make him right. I think a lot about Ellen these days, what she would say if she saw what had become of us, of me. I like to think she'd be angry, that she'd march down those stairs and tell Daniel off, that she'd say, "This is not how we treat the man who built this family." But maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she'd just sit beside me in the dark and hold my hand. That would be enough. Last week, the real moment came. I was lying on the mattress, legs stiff, hands trembling from a new round of tremors that the doctor called expected at your age. I called upstairs. "Daniel, could you bring me something to eat?" There was a pause, then his voice, clear and cold, through the stairwell. "Crawl if you want food." The words sliced through me cleaner than any bullet I ever took. For a long time, I didn't move. I stared at the ceiling and wondered how we'd come to this. Then I pulled myself off the mattress, gritting my teeth, and began to crawl toward the stairs. I knew something had changed in me. I didn't know it yet, but I'd just declared war. The next morning I woke up sore in every joint, every tendon, and every corner of my pride. My knees were swollen, the skin raw from dragging them across the concrete floor the night before, and my palms were grazed, tiny blisters forming near the base of each thumb. I didn't sleep much. The pain was sharp, but it wasn't the pain that kept me awake. It was the silence upstairs, the kind of silence that follows something deliberate, something cruel. Daniel hadn't come down. No food, no voice, not even the sound of footsteps above me. I don't know if he thought I'd actually crawl, or if he was simply testing how far he could push me before I broke. But I knew, lying there in the dark, with the taste of carpet glue in my throat, that something had snapped between us. Whatever thread of connection had remained, father to son, man to man, it had torn during those 3 words he flung down the stairwell. Crawl for food. When I finally managed to stand, with the help of the pipe bolted to the wall near my cot, my legs buckled twice before holding me. I felt like a dog who'd been kicked too many times, still limping toward its master with some misplaced hope of affection. I hated that I felt that way, hated how, even after being humiliated, I still expected a moment of decency, a tray left at the top of the stairs, maybe even a muttered apology. But there was nothing. No clatter of dishes, no footsteps, just the hum of the refrigerator upstairs and the quiet creak of the house settling in its bones. By noon, the hunger was a dull roar in my gut, layered with shame. I knew I could wait it out. Eventually, Sharon would remember I hadn't eaten and bring something down. Maybe, or maybe they decided I was more convenient when quiet and out of sight. Maybe this was a new phase in the slow erosion of my humanity, testing how long I could go without food before complaining. Maybe they wanted to see if I'd crawl again. I didn't want to give them that satisfaction. But pride doesn't keep a man alive. So I reached for the walking cane I'd bought myself from a second-hand shop the year before, the one I'd hidden behind the water heater so Sharon wouldn't nag me to stop clinging to things I couldn't use properly. I gripped it like a weapon. It took nearly 10 minutes to get to the bottom of the stairs. The basement was long and narrow, and I had to rest twice, sitting on an overturned bucket. My breath wheezed in and out of my chest like an old accordion, each inhalation sharp and ragged. The stairs loomed above me like a mountain. 13 steps. I knew that because I had counted them every day since moving in. They were wooden, steep, and uncarpeted, each one a risk, each one an invitation to fall and never get back up. I didn't trust my right leg to carry me, so I climbed on all fours, dragging my body slowly, testing each plank with trembling hands. Halfway up, my knee slipped, and my shin slammed against the edge. The pain was immediate and bright, like electricity surging through bone. I nearly tumbled backward, but I caught myself, teeth clenched so hard I thought they'd crack. At the top of the stairs, I paused. I didn't know what I expected to find. A meal on the counter? An apology scribbled on a napkin? Instead, the kitchen was empty. Spotless, in fact. The lights were off. The fridge hummed. The countertops gleamed. There were no sounds of life. No TV. No voices. I limped toward the fridge and opened it. Inside there was plenty. Roast chicken wrapped in foil, a container of mashed potatoes, cut fruit in a plastic bowl, yogurt, eggs, salad greens. They were eating well, just not feeding me. I stood there for a full minute, staring at the food, unsure if taking it would be considered theft in their eyes. Then I remembered. This was my pension, my Social Security check, my life they were living. I reached in and grabbed the container of chicken, wincing as the cold bit into my scraped fingers. That's when I heard it, a giggle, faint, almost childlike. I turned toward the living room and saw the glow of a phone screen through the half-closed door. Sharon's voice followed, hushed but audible. He actually did it? You filmed him? A pause, then another giggle. Send it to me. It's too good not to share. I felt my legs buckle again, but not from weakness this time, from something deeper, from humiliation so thick it felt like cement in my lungs. They had filmed me, crawling, struggling, reduced to a trembling old man on his hands and knees, desperate for food, and they'd turned it into entertainment. Content. I couldn't breathe. I leaned against the fridge, feeling the cool air from the open door sweep against my face. I didn't confront them. I didn't shout. I didn't demand they delete the video. I didn't ask who else had seen it or if they'd posted it online. I just closed the fridge, took the container of chicken, and went back down the stairs as quietly as I could, one hand clutching the railing, the other shaking, with the weight of what I'd become in their eyes. In the basement, I ate with my hands. No fork, no napkin, no dignity. Just meat torn apart by crooked fingers and a hunger that was no longer just physical. It was spiritual, existential. It was the hunger to matter again, to be seen not as a burden, but as a man. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at the small folding table near the furnace and started writing. Not a letter, not a journal, a plan. Every mission starts with a plan. I listed what I still had: my military ID, my VA benefits, my driver's license, even though I hadn't driven in years, a small amount of cash, bills I had hidden inside an old Reader's Digest, a prepaid flip phone I'd bought 2 Christmases ago because I didn't trust smartphones, and the number of Vince Carraway, the only man alive who had once pulled me out of a jungle swamp in '68 with bullets flying over our heads. We hadn't spoken in years, but Vince owed me a favor. More importantly, he believed in debt the way old soldiers do. I wasn't going to ask him for a place to stay. I wasn't going to ask him to fight my battles. I just needed one ride, one moment of escape, because now I knew I had to get out, not for revenge, not even for justice, but for survival. They had made me crawl. Now I would make them watch me rise. The days that followed passed like smoke, slow, bitter, and clinging to everything. After the incident on the stairs, something shifted in the house. Daniel avoided me almost completely, and when he did appear, it was with the exaggerated calm of someone performing good behavior for a camera. He began to address me like a nurse might speak to a patient in a care facility. "Are we feeling okay today? Don't forget to take your pills. Try not to make a mess." It was patronizing, deliberate, and laced with the kind of thinly disguised resentment that made every word feel like a slap. Sharon, on the other hand, grew bolder. She didn't even pretend anymore. One morning, when I ventured upstairs to ask for laundry detergent, she glanced at my shirt, wrinkled and stained from sleep, and said, "Maybe it's time we think about a place that can really take care of you." I asked her what she meant. She smiled tightly and said, "Assisted living, somewhere clean, regulated, with staff who can handle situations." I knew exactly what she meant. She wanted me out, removed, declared incapable, and stored away like a broken appliance that took up too much space in their otherwise curated life. It wasn't just neglect anymore, it was strategy. The realization of their plan settled on me like frost, cold and inescapable. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were manufacturing my decline. They were positioning themselves to take control, not just of my body, but of my money, my records, my legacy. I saw it in the way Daniel insisted on handling my prescriptions now, the way he questioned whether I remembered to lock the door or whether I had confused the day of the week. I started noticing things disappearing again. My pension statements, a letter from the VA, even my Medicare card. I confronted him once, asking where it had gone, and he waved it off. "You must have misplaced it. You forget things all the time." But I didn't. Not yet. My mind was still mine, and I was remembering everything with clarity that bordered on painful. So I began to fight back. Not loudly, not with confrontation, but in the quiet, tactical way a man learns when he's been trained for war. I started by testing my body, pushing against its limits like a prisoner mapping the dimensions of a cell. Each morning, before they were awake, I forced myself to stand unsupported for 30 seconds, then 40, then a minute. I gripped the back of my metal chair and lifted my feet, one at a time, practicing balance. I fashioned a set of makeshift hand weights from old canned food and duct tape, curling them until my arms trembled with fatigue. At night, I did leg lifts on the cot, biting the inside of my cheek to stop from crying out when the muscles cramped. I trained in silence, in darkness, because noise invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited sabotage. I wasn't ready to let them know I was preparing to leave. The cane helped. I could now reach the stairs without crawling. The first few times I tried climbing again, I nearly passed out from the effort, but I made it. Step by step, like a soldier advancing under fire. I never let them see me practice. If they thought I was stronger than I appeared, they might move faster with their plan. I needed time, and I needed help. That's when I called Vince. It took me 3 tries to dial the number correctly on the prepaid flip phone. My fingers were stiff, and my eyes had grown used to squinting in dim light. When Vince answered, his voice was hoarse with sleep, though it was well past noon. "Caraway," he said flatly. I waited a moment before speaking. "It's Ellison." A beat of silence followed. Then, "Jesus Christ, I thought you were dead." "Not yet," I said, "but I might be if I don't get out of here." I didn't give him every detail, just enough. That I was living in a basement, that my son was trying to take control of my accounts, that I needed a ride out, a safe place to think. Vince didn't ask questions. He said, "Give me 3 days. I'll come get you at night." I thanked him. He said nothing. That's how it always was with Vince. Silence was his version of loyalty. Now I had a deadline. 3 days to prepare, 3 days to organize my documents, gather what little cash I had left, and arrange for my escape without arousing suspicion. I began hiding things around the basement, taping spare cash into hollowed-out book spines, rolling my IDs inside socks, even disassembling an old flashlight to stash my prescription list inside. I packed my duffel bag in layers, papers at the bottom, clothes and toiletries above. I taped a note to myself inside the front flap. "You are not crazy. You are leaving because they made you." I was worried that in the confusion, in the fear of sudden change, I might doubt myself. That note became my anchor. During those 3 days, Daniel and Sharon's behavior grew more peculiar. I overheard a phone conversation Daniel had late at night. He was speaking in low tones, pacing the living room above me. I only caught fragments. "Yes, we have the medical records, early signs, but enough? Yes, he signed some documents already." That last part made my blood run cold. What documents? I hadn't signed anything since I gave them power of attorney to manage some hospital paperwork after my stroke years ago. Had they forged something? Or had they tricked me into signing more than I realized? The next day, I went through the folder where I kept my records. Half of it was gone. I began to realize that their plan wasn't just theoretical anymore. It was in motion. They weren't just thinking about putting me in a home. They were assembling a case, a narrative. They were documenting signs of dementia, recording episodes, and collecting whatever pieces of paper they needed to legally remove me from their lives and their house, while keeping everything else I had earned. I started sleeping during the day and staying awake at night, alert for any movement. I heard them discussing me often, but never directly, always through walls, through floors, through muffled tones. Sharon once said, "What if he snaps? What if he does something?" Daniel responded, "He can't even make it up the stairs without a nap. We just need a few more things on paper, and then we can take care of it." That phrase stuck in my mind. Take care of it. They talked about me like a problem to be resolved, not a man to be helped. On the final night before Vince was due to arrive, I sat awake in my chair, fully dressed, bag packed, cane at my side. I rehearsed every step of the plan in my mind. I would wait until I heard them go to bed. Then I'd disable the basement door latch from inside, a trick I'd figured out using a fork and rubber band. I'd exit through the side door, leave the house on foot, and meet Vince 3 blocks down, near the old gas station where the payphone used to be. I hadn't felt that focused since my days in the jungle. My heart was pounding, not with fear, but with purpose. The kind of purpose a man forgets he's capable of once others start treating him like a piece of furniture. I didn't leave a note. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of a goodbye or an explanation. Let them wake up and find the cot empty, the basement silent, the air stale with absence. Let them panic. Let them wonder if I'd finally died on their watch. I was tempted to leave the video playing on their TV, the one they filmed of me crawling. But no, I wouldn't give them the power to make it into another performance. When Vince's headlights finally swept across the far curb at 2:17 a.m., I stepped into the night without looking back. They had underestimated me. That was their first mistake. Their second was thinking I had nothing left to lose. But I still had one thing. One precious burning thing they hadn't stolen yet. My will. Vince didn't speak for the first 15 minutes of the drive, which suited me fine. We rode in silence through the empty streets, the town shrinking behind us like a forgotten idea. He drove a beat-up Ford pickup, smelled faintly of tobacco and engine oil, and wore the same patched leather jacket he'd had back in the 80s. His hair was thinner now, mostly gray, but his hands were still strong, and his presence steady in a way that made me feel like I hadn't vanished completely from the world. The radio was off. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of a toolbox behind the seat. When he finally spoke, it was like he hadn't taken a breath in years. "You looked worse than I expected," he said without glancing over. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. I was worse than I'd expected, too. "How long's it been like that?" he asked. I thought about it. Not just the weeks, but the years, the slow unspooling of time, the erosion of boundaries, of pride, of self. "Since Ellen died," I said. He nodded. "Knew she kept you upright. Women do that. Keep the roof from collapsing, even when the walls start to rot." I watched the road disappear under the headlights. "I didn't think it would get that bad," I muttered. "Didn't think he'd—" I stopped. Saying it out loud made it real in a way that hurt more than the truth should have. We drove until dawn. Vince took me to a small cabin outside Janesville, the kind people used for fishing weekends or illicit affairs. It had a wood stove, a working sink, a cot, and not much else. But it was warm, private, and smelled like cedar and rust instead of mildew and disrespect. I could breathe. That was the first thing I noticed. I could actually breathe without the weight of someone else's disappointment pressing down on my chest. Vince handed me a thermos of coffee and sat on the porch, lighting a cigarette. "You're safe here for a few days," he said, "but after that, you'll need a plan." I nodded. "I already have one." I spent the next 48 hours making calls, organizing documents, and reestablishing my identity. First was the bank. I needed to know if Daniel had touched my accounts. I used a public library computer under a fake name and logged in using old passwords I'd memorized like prayers. What I found confirmed everything. 2 large withdrawals, one for $5,000, the other declined for $20,000, both attempted the day after I left. He'd wasted no time. He thought I was already legally helpless. Next, I called my attorney, an old colleague named Norwood, from my days in the postal union. He hadn't heard from me in years, but remembered my name. I explained the situation. He didn't sound surprised. "This happens more than you think," he said. "Family thinks you're frail, starts maneuvering behind your back." I asked him what I could do. He said, "First, we lock them out of your accounts. Second, we revoke any power of attorney they may be abusing. Third, we document everything, emails, voicemails, any evidence they've tried to present you as incompetent." While Norwood got to work, I wrote out a detailed timeline of everything that had happened over the last 2 years. Every slight, every missing document, every whispered conversation I overheard through the vents. I included the video. I didn't have a copy, but I described the incident, what I heard, what I saw, and who witnessed it. I wasn't going to let it disappear into gaslit memory. That crawl up the stairs, the humiliation in their laughter, that was the moment I lost my fear of retaliation. When someone films you suffering and calls it content, they're no longer your family. They're predators. Norwood connected me with a doctor, someone outside the local network, someone who didn't know Daniel or Sharon or their narrative. I underwent a full cognitive evaluation, not because I doubted my mind, but because I needed proof. It took 4 hours. Memory tests, logic puzzles, language recall, coordination exams. When it was over, the doctor looked at me and said, "You're sharper than most 50-year-olds I see." I nodded, silently grateful, though not surprised. I hadn't lost my mind. I'd lost my power. That was what they were trying to take. The diagnosis report became the first official nail in the coffin of their scheme. On the 3rd day, Vince returned to check on me. He brought supplies, canned food, clean clothes, and an old rotary phone he said was less trackable. He also brought news. "They called me," he said. "Your son. Wanted to know if I'd seen you. Claimed you wandered off. Said you were a danger to yourself." I stared at him. "What did you say?" "Told him I hadn't seen you since Nam. Hung up before he could fish." I nodded. "They're scared," I said. "They should be." That night, I stood outside the cabin and looked at the stars. I hadn't seen them in years. The basement had no view, and the city lights drowned everything above into a dull gray haze. Out here, the sky was open, expansive, like the world had suddenly remembered I existed. I felt something stir in my chest, not joy, not peace exactly, but resolve. I wasn't going to disappear. I wasn't going to die quietly so someone else could live more comfortably. I was going to remind them what I was made of, what kind of man they had tried to break. I called Norwood the next morning and gave him the go-ahead to start filing the paperwork. Revocations, claims, asset protections. "I want everything frozen," I told him, "and I want them to know it was me." He chuckled. "You sure you don't want to soften the blow? Maybe send a letter?" "No," I said. "I want them to feel it." It was time to fight back. Not for vengeance, but for truth. I was no longer a bystander in my own life. I didn't crawl to survive. I crawled so I could rise. 3 weeks passed in silence, but it was a silence unlike the basement's, a silence of purpose, of movement behind the curtain, of things being set in motion. Norwood was tireless. Every day he called with new updates, forms to sign, statements to submit. He had the power of attorney annulled, froze all accounts tied to my Social Security and pension, and initiated an official notification process with my banks and benefits administrators. The moment we got confirmation of the revocation, I saw it, like watching the lever pulled that dropped the gate. Their faces weren't in front of me, but I could imagine them. Sharon with her face flushed in outrage, Daniel pacing, confused, realizing too late that the old man had slipped the leash. They would have called everyone, the bank, the VA, maybe even the police. They would have said I was confused, lost, sick. But the doctor's report we submitted before any of it began had shut that door before they even reached for the handle. I was not only legally competent, I was sharper than ever, and now I had witnesses, evidence, and control. Vince took me to Norwood's office in the city for the first in-person meeting. It was strange being in a suit again, even an old one. The sleeves were looser than I remembered, my body thinner and harder from weeks of plain food and silent determination. Norwood, a barrel-chested man with tired eyes and the calm energy of someone used to cleaning up legal wreckage, sat across from me and unrolled a blueprint of options. "We can pursue charges," he said. "Elder abuse, financial fraud, misrepresentation, but I think the faster path is civil. You want distance, right? You want freedom, not revenge." I nodded slowly. "I want my life back," I said. "And I want to make sure they don't do this to someone else." He steepled his fingers and looked at me seriously. "Then we go for guardianship immunity, asset retrieval, and retroactive claim of financial exploitation. That means proving a pattern. Can you document what they took?" I handed him a folder I'd been building for weeks. Handwritten notes, copies of statements I'd managed to recover, the bank logs showing unusual withdrawals, and a detailed ledger of items that had gone missing from my files. There was also a list of witnesses, nurses, the pharmacist, the mail carrier who noticed my checks stopped arriving, and even a neighbor who once asked Sharon why I never came outside. "We may not get it all back," Norwood warned, "but they'll wish they never touched a dollar of it." At the same time, we filed to contest ownership of the house. When I'd signed over part of the proceeds from the sale of my own home after Ellen died, Daniel promised me I'd be a co-owner on the new place, that I'd always have a roof. The paperwork told a different story. The deed had been altered, quietly, incrementally, until I was listed as a co-borrower, not a co-owner, with no controlling interest. But what Daniel didn't know was that I had kept a copy of the original arrangement in a locked box Ellen had given me for our anniversary. Norwood reviewed it and smiled. "This changes everything," he said. "We'll file for partition. They either buy you out or we force the sale." That was the blow I wanted. The slow, precise turning of the wheel in my favor. They had filmed me crawling. Now they'd crawl through paperwork, through courtrooms, through shame. Then came the unexpected twist. Sharon's sister contacted me. I didn't know her well. We'd only met twice, briefly, at holiday dinners. But her voice on the phone was tentative, apologetic, and laced with something that sounded like guilt. "I heard about what happened," she said. "I don't know the whole story, but I've been meaning to tell someone." I stayed quiet, waiting. She took a breath. "Sharon, she talked about moving you to a long-term care facility, not for medical reasons. She said it would give them legal clarity. She was trying to declare you mentally incompetent. I didn't agree with it, but she said it was the only way to keep their finances stable. They'd already taken a line of credit out against your accounts. Daniel said you didn't need the money anymore." I closed my eyes as she spoke, not out of surprise, but out of something colder. Confirmation. They had been planning it all along, not just ignoring me, not just humiliating me. They were building a world where I didn't exist, except as a source of cash. "Thank you," I told her. "I hope you never have to be on this side of that kind of betrayal." As Norwood began filing formal accusations of financial abuse, a new problem arose. Daniel had retained a lawyer. I expected that. What I didn't expect was the direction they took. They weren't denying the money transfers, the power of attorney changes, or the attempts to alter legal ownership. Instead, they were building a case that I was mentally unstable, prone to delusion, and a threat to myself. They submitted fake medical evaluations, notes with forged signatures, and one completely fabricated document claiming I had tried to light a fire stove in the basement with a match and nearly caused an explosion. Norwood was furious. "This is perjury. This is criminal," he muttered. But I wasn't surprised. They'd lost control of me, and now they wanted the court to put the leash back on. But it was too late. We responded with our own documentation, the real medical exam, signed and notarized by 3 specialists, recorded statements from healthcare workers attesting to my condition and clarity, even the call logs showing how I had reached out for help weeks before I left. More importantly, we submitted evidence of the video, Sharon's voice in the background laughing, mocking. That clip, though we didn't possess the original file, had already been shared in a private message by one of Sharon's co-workers. She had forwarded it to another colleague with the message, "Can you believe this old guy? Should have crawled faster." We traced the message, obtained a copy, and submitted it. That was the nail. The kind of cruelty no jury would ignore. By now, news had begun to circulate, slowly, quietly. I wasn't a public figure, but local press had picked up on the case as part of a wider feature on elder abuse. A journalist reached out to me. I didn't agree to an interview, but I told him one thing. This happens every day to people without lawyers, without friends, without anyone watching. If my story helps one of them, then it's worth it. Daniel and Sharon called me one final time. I let it go to voicemail. His voice was ragged, panicked, defiant. "You don't have to do this, Dad. We can fix this. You're confused. You're just tired. Come home. We'll talk it out." Sharon's voice came in at the end, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. But the tone was unmistakable. Fear. Not of me, but of what they had set in motion and could no longer stop. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The wheels were turning. The house was under threat of partition. The courts were reviewing the fraud charges. Their accounts were being investigated for misuse of federal benefits. And I was free, not just physically, but psychologically. I had broken the frame they tried to force around me. I was no longer the man in the basement. I was the man who came back up the stairs and kept going. The hearing took place on a rainy Thursday morning, one of those Midwest storms that seems to crawl across the sky like a slow punishment. I didn't wear a suit this time. I wore the same olive green jacket I had worn when I left Daniel's house in the middle of the night, its cuffs still faintly smelling of damp wood and resolve. Norwood met me outside the courthouse steps, a thick binder under one arm, his expression unreadable except for the faint twitch in his jaw that told me he was ready to fight. "Their lawyer's going to push for a delay," he warned. "They're claiming you're still not competent enough to make these claims, but don't worry. We've got more than enough to shut that down." I nodded but didn't speak. I didn't need words. What I needed was to look them in the eye, to be present in the room. They never imagined I'd enter again, not as a burden or a ghost, but as a man standing on his own feet. Inside the courtroom, the walls were too white, the lighting too sterile, and the air too cold for what was about to happen. Daniel sat at the table to the left, Sharon beside him, her hands tightly clasped in her lap like she was praying for a reality where none of this had happened. He looked different, older, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous tick in his right cheek I didn't recognize. Maybe he had lost sleep, wondering if the man he filmed crawling would dare to rise again in front of strangers, in front of the law. Maybe he never really thought I'd survive being discarded. But here I was. The judge was an older woman with gray hair tied back in a bun, the kind of face that had seen through more lies than most people spoke in a lifetime. She addressed both parties briskly and asked for opening statements. Norwood stood and spoke with the calm, deliberate rhythm of someone who knew the weight of each word. He didn't dramatize. He laid out the facts. The power of attorney obtained under false pretenses, the financial activity inconsistent with elder care, the attempt to establish guardianship without medical necessity, the submission of fraudulent documents, and finally, the social and psychological abuse evidenced by the video clip. "This is not simply a case of misunderstanding," he concluded. "This is a calculated attempt to exploit a vulnerable man under the illusion of care." Their lawyer, a thin man in an ill-fitting navy suit, tried to pivot. He spoke of confusion, of generational miscommunication, of the stress that caregiving imposes on young families. He portrayed Daniel and Sharon as overwhelmed, perhaps misguided, but fundamentally concerned. "They acted out of fear," he said, "fear that Mr. Ellison's declining memory and erratic behavior might endanger him." The judge looked down at her notes without expression. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for. "Do you have medical documentation supporting your claim of cognitive decline?" The lawyer cleared his throat, stammered, and then reluctantly acknowledged that the primary documents had been withdrawn pending verification. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of waving a white flag. Then it was my turn. I stood, slow but steady, cane in one hand, binder in the other. The judge asked if I wanted to read a statement or answer questions. I said, "I'll speak freely, Your Honor." My voice was rough at first, but it held. I looked directly at my son as I spoke, not to accuse, but to show him that I was not afraid, not silenced. "I raised that boy to be better than what he became," I said. "I served this country. I paid my bills. I buried my wife with my own hands. I lived through combat, illness, loss, and I never once asked for pity. All I ever wanted was respect. When I moved into their house, I thought I was going to be part of a family again, but I wasn't a guest. I was an inconvenience. I wasn't cared for. I was managed, silenced, hidden. I told the court about the basement, about the food rationing, about crawling to the top of the stairs for a plate of dinner, about the laughter, the video, the looks of disgust. I told them about waking up every day, wondering if I was being slowly erased, not from memory, but from paper, from law, from the right to exist as a man. I spoke without bitterness. I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth did all the shouting. "I may walk slower," I said, "but I see clearly. I may have scars, but I remember who I am, and I remember what they did." Silence filled the courtroom when I finished. No one spoke, not even Daniel. He sat frozen, eyes lowered, a flicker of shame, finally breaching the smugness he'd worn like armor for so long. Sharon beside him looked straight ahead, her jaw clenched like she was swallowing the bitter realization that there would be no graceful exit from this. The judge adjourned the hearing for 20 minutes to deliberate. I waited in the hallway, my back pressed against the cool marble wall, Kane resting between my knees. Norwood sat beside me, leafing through his papers, without focus. "You did good in there," he said eventually. I nodded but didn't reply. I wasn't thinking about victory. I was thinking about Ellen, about what she would have said if she had seen all this unfold. Part of me wanted to believe she would have wept, not for the pain, but for the resilience. Another part feared she would have blamed herself for raising a son who turned on his own blood. But I knew one thing for certain. She would have held my hand when I walked out of that courtroom, and that would have been enough. When we returned to the chamber, the judge didn't waste time. Her decision was swift and final. The petition for guardianship was denied. All powers of attorney granted to Daniel or Sharon were permanently revoked. A civil inquiry into financial abuse would proceed, and a third-party fiduciary would audit the previous 2 years of transactions. Furthermore, a motion to partition the house was accepted, with full rights of ownership investigation under review. The gavel hit the block. It was done. As we stood to leave, Daniel turned to me. He didn't speak, but his lips trembled, and his eyes, those same eyes that once looked up at me after riding a bike for the first time, were hollow now, not from defeat, but from the crumbling of an illusion. He had thought I was broken. He had convinced himself I was already gone, but I wasn't, and he knew it now. I walked past him without a word, not out of malice, but out of peace. There was nothing left to say. I had fought my battle. I had won, and I was ready to start again, not as a father hoping to be loved, but as a man determined to live on his own terms. The house sold faster than anyone expected, though I wasn't surprised. It sat on a good street, with decent schools, and a finished basement. Ironic, considering that was the same space they had tried to turn into my grave. Norwood handled everything. After the sale, my share was deposited into a separate account, untouchable by anyone but me. Daniel and Sharon received what they were legally owed, though I imagine it felt more like a punishment than a reward. Their dreams of absorbing my life piece by piece, replaced by legal bills and the growing echo of their own choices. I never heard what happened to their salon plans or Daniel's crypto investments, and I didn't care. The finality of the gavel in that courtroom had severed something deep and permanent. There would be no reconciliation, no forced holiday dinners or hollow apologies. The door was closed, and I intended to keep it that way. I moved into a small cottage 2 hours north, nestled near a lake, with trees older than most of the people I'd known. The cabin wasn't much, just one bedroom, a screened porch, and a wood-burning stove, but it was mine. I filled it with books, blankets, and quiet. I rose with the sun and walked short distances each day, measuring progress, not by speed, but by steadiness. I made coffee on the stove, read newspapers in the afternoons, and cooked my own meals without needing permission or apology. For the first time in years, I wasn't under surveillance. I wasn't managed. I was simply a man in his own home. And that was enough. Vince came by every week. Sometimes we didn't talk much. We'd just sit on the porch, drinking beer, and watching the trees move in the wind like slow dancers. He brought me tools, helped fix the door hinge, repaired the chimney, even hooked up an old radio we found at a swap meet. I told him he saved my life. He just shook his head and said, "You would have found a way out eventually. You always do." We didn't talk about the war or the basement or Daniel. Some things don't need words. They sit between men like smoke, visible, understood, and unnecessary to name. One morning, in early October, I was chopping firewood behind the house when I saw a figure coming up the path from the main road. It was Daniel. I knew it before I could see his face. The way he walked, the slight stoop in his shoulders, the shape of his frame, I had memorized long ago. For a moment, I thought about going back inside, locking the door, pretending not to be home. But something kept me rooted to the spot, axe in hand, heart steady. He approached slowly like a man uncertain whether the house before him was friend or foe. His face was drawn, paler than I remembered, with dark hollows under his eyes. His clothes were clean, but wrinkled, his shoes dusty from the walk. When he finally reached me, he didn't speak right away, just looked at me, then at the axe in my hand, then back at me. "I didn't know where else to go," he said at last, voice brittle as twigs. I said nothing. I simply waited. He looked down at the dirt, then slowly dropped to his knees in front of me. "I was wrong," he whispered. "About everything, about you, about what we did. I thought you were weak. I thought you wouldn't fight back. I didn't think you'd survive it." His voice cracked. "I didn't think you were still my father." I looked at him, this grown man who had once ridden on my shoulders at the county fair, who had once brought me handmade cards on Father's Day with crooked letters and glue-stuck corners. And now He knelt before me, not out of ceremony, not an apology, but because he didn't know how to stand in front of the man he'd tried to destroy. For a long time, I didn't move. Then I spoke, slowly, deliberately. "Crawl, if you want food." He flinched. The words landed hard, the way they were meant to, a mirror held up to his cruelty. But then I dropped the axe into the grass and stepped forward. "No," I said, "I won't do to you what you did to me. That's not who I am. But that doesn't mean I forgive you." He looked up, tears in his eyes. I helped him to his feet. "You're not welcome here, Daniel. Not now. Maybe not ever. But you can walk back to that road with your head high and think about what kind of man you want to be next time someone trusts you." He nodded, trembling, then turned and left without another word. As I watched him disappear down the trail, I felt no triumph, no bitterness, no relief, only clarity. The war was over. I had won not by destroying my enemy, but by refusing to become him. And in that quiet, solitary moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I was free.